Welcome to East Asia Pulse, a podcast series by the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. I'm Frank Pieke, and I will be your host today. For this episode of the podcast, our guest is Steve Okun, the founder and CEO of APAC Advisors, which is a leader on corporate public affairs, environmental, social and governance, investing, sustainability and stakeholder engagement. He spent the first 12 years of his career in Washington, D.C., including service in the administration of President Bill Clinton. He has lived and worked in Asia since 2003. And during that time, he served 5 terms as chair of the American Chamber of Commerce of Asia Pacific here in Singapore. So, welcome, Steve, and thank you very much for talking to us.
My pleasure to be here. Always great to be involved with NUS and the East Asia Institute.
We are speaking on the 2nd May of 2025, just a few days after Donald Trump's 100-day speech. Southeast Asia is one of the world's most prominent geopolitical arenas where the US-China conflict is fought, and what happens here will play a very big role in how the international order will look like in the next decade or so. As the world's first and second largest economies, the US and China continue to be deeply interconnected and interdependent, despite the efforts of China to become self-reliant and the US agenda to decouple from China in strategic sectors. This development has by no means fully played itself out, or, as Scott Kennedy, a previous guest of our podcast series, recently put it, the end game is nowhere near in sight. So I'd like to begin by exploring possible future steps and their consequences in each country. So Steve, how successful do you think that China is in Trump-proofing its economy? And what role does the realignment of supply chains and investment play in all of that?
I guess to start with, what China's doing has been going on for 2 decades. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump and Trump-proofing. It isn't about what Donald Trump has been doing this term or in his first term. It's what China has been trying to do that the United States has issues with. And not just the United States. The EU has the same issues. Japan has the same issues. So what are we talking about when we talk about China's issues? We can, if you want to go back, we want to go back 20 years. You can go to 2006. And that's when China came out with its policy on indigenous innovation. And China said, we are going to use the power of the state to make sure that the innovation that we need and that can be exported to the world is done in China from Chinese characteristics that we can protect and defend when we need to. So you can go back to 2006. If you want to go back to 2015, that is when China came out with its Made in China 2025 policy, which has been extraordinarily successful. Maybe not perfectly successful, but extraordinarily successful. That is when China said, we are going to dominate the key sectors of the 21st century, and we're going to do that through state subsidies. We're going to do it by creating an unlevel playing field for foreign companies, and we are going to then be in a position to dominate those sectors, not just in China, but globally. And then that led to the 2020 policy of what they call dual circulation. So China for China within China, and then you use China to export to the global markets. This is what China has been doing. And if you want to call it Trump-proofing, you can call it Trump-proofing, but it has nothing to do with Donald Trump. And the United States has had issues with this. Europe has had issues with this. Japan has had issues with this. What Donald Trump is doing in addressing these problems is very different than what happened from President Obama, Donald Trump even in his first term, which Joe Biden continued with. And that's what brings us to the trade war that we're at today. But you've got to go back to what China's been doing to understand it.
Right. So are you saying that China should simply continue to do what it already has been doing, or does it need to do something different now that Trump is focusing so much on tariffs and so much on trade?
Well, this is the question now of where Donald Trump is taking this. So the concerns that countries have had with China with regards to Made in China 2025, right? How have they tried to address those? If you looked at what President Obama tried to do, President Obama said, we're going to shift away from this U.S. approach of engage with China, accommodate them into the global rules-based trading system, because over time they will become more like us. That didn't happen. Now, you could say it didn't happen because it was never going to happen and the Americans and everybody else got China wrong and that was their fault. Or you could say China changed its journey around 2012 or so, and that was the divergence from it going into the existing global rules-based system. But that is Where we are now is the recognition that the old system of engage and accommodate didn't work. What President Obama tried to do, what President Biden tried to do, was to bring along partners and allies and like-minded countries to get China to change or to come up with a system in which China was going to be on the outside looking in. Donald Trump is going in a very different direction, and he is going into a bilateral direction. It is, we are going to do this on our own with China. We're going to do on our own vis-a-vis Japan and vis-a-vis Vietnam and everybody else. And so we're leaving the global rules-based system. And the question is, what is going to replace it? What role will the United States have? What role will China have? That's why there's so much uncertainty and volatility right now.
So you're saying that China is being dealt with by the Trump administration as simply one of the many countries that the US tries to realign its relationships with, or is there something going on that's a little bit more with China?
Well, it's certainly a little bit more with China. I mean, if you look at the America First approach to trade, America First approach to how it engages with countries, the view is that the United States is the biggest, strongest, most important market in the world in every conceivable factor. It is in terms of the economy. It is in terms of the military. It is in terms of geopolitics. And the America First view is that the U.S. is more effective and better from an America First perspective if it engages with every country one-on-one. If it engages into a multilateral or plurilateral framework and other countries can gang up on the United States, then the United States loses its leverage. Or as Donald Trump might say, the United States has all the cards, right, when it plays one-on-one with someone. So that is where the U.S. says, how are we going to address Vietnam? We're going to address Vietnam vis-a-vis the United States and the trade imbalance we have with them, with Cambodia, with everybody. Now, China is different because it's not only about unfair trade practices. The United States, not just Donald Trump, the United States and Democrats, Republicans alike, view China as somewhere between a strategic competitor to existential threat to the United States of America. And that makes China very different from how it deals with everybody else. And that's why Donald Trump has 10% tariffs on Singapore, but 125% tariffs on China.
So against that background, to what extent are trade tariffs an effective way of dealing with what the US perceives as to be the larger China threat? And is this the right way of doing this, you think?
I mean, tariffs can be the right way. If you talk about sector specific, there are certain sectors countries need to protect for their national security interests. The auto sector is one of those. So when you see tariffs going onto China when it comes to automobiles, it is not just the United States that is tariffing China. The EU tariffs China. Japan tariff, I believe Japan has tariffs on
Sure.
Chinese autos. Most countries have tariffs because countries need an auto sector, because it's not just about making cars that you can sell to your own people. It's about your defense industry as well. It's about your military as well. You need the auto sector because that is part of what they provide in terms of equipment. So yes, tariffs on certain sectors can make sense. Tariffs can be effective if there is a specific problem from a specific country, like it is putting in too many state subsidies and you have a case of dumping goods into your market. So tariffs can make sense. Universal tariffs make no sense. That's not what tariffs should be for. And certainly tariffs at a certain level really make no sense. You want to get a country to change. I mean, what's the purpose of your tariffs? We don't know why Donald Trump is using these tariffs. Is he using these tariffs to try and get countries to change? Is he using these tariffs to try and change the trade imbalance that the United States has with a lot of them? Or is he using them to raise revenue to get tax cuts for wealthy people in the United States? We don't know. So that's the question of what is he doing with these tariffs? Tariffs are not always wrong, but they certainly, I would argue, are wrong in how Donald Trump is, in his administration, has implemented them to date.
So basically you're saying that tariffs is not a good way of containing China or reducing China's power. It's a good way, perhaps, or to engage China on your own terms, but not the larger geopolitical component, as it were. Is that what you were saying?
Sure. Yeah. Tariffs are one tool. You have tariffs. You may want to have export controls tariffs on certain goods. You would certainly want to work with partners and allies when it comes to competing with or getting China to change. Don't do it just by yourself. President Obama tried to do it with the TPP that, Donald Trump pulled out of it on day 3. President Biden tried to do a watered-down version of the TPP through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that appears to be dead under Donald Trump. Anything in terms of working with partners and allies should be core to your strategy from a U.S. perspective in dealing with China. And right now, there's literally no, from an economic and trade perspective, there's militarily, but no economic and trade coordination in getting China to change or contain it.
So you're almost saying that Donald Trump is his own worst enemy when it comes to his geopolitical objectives and how to get there, right?
Well, for the first 100 days, we would say he's going down that path. Now, what's going to happen? We've got dozens of countries negotiating with the United States right now. Look, you could see something coming down where the United States says to these countries, if we are going to reduce our tariffs on you, India, if we're going to reduce our tariffs on you, Vietnam, Singapore, whoever it may be, part of what you have to commit to is not engaging with China to some degree. Now, that is basically another way of getting to what the TPP tried to accomplish. So I think it's 100 days in or 101 or 102, wherever we are now, a little too early to say that it has been a failure, what the Trump administration has tried to do, because maybe they will course correct. Maybe this will just naturally go into a different direction, and there will be some type of change that China has to undertake because of what the United States is trying to do.
So how resilient do you think the U.S. economy is to bear, as it were, the consequences of Donald Trump's trade tariffs and other trade policies, particularly vis-a-vis China? I think that's the big question, right?
Yeah, and everything's relative, right? So I think if you're talking about a U.S.-China trade war, the U.S. is more resilient economically. It has a stronger economy than China has. It has a larger economy. It has domestic consumption. It has potential more trading partners than China might have. So the U.S. vis-a-vis China is more economically resilient. What may be the case, though, is that China is more politically resilient than the United States. That the political pain that the party can bear is probably stronger than it is in the United States. You've got midterm elections that President Trump, or at least certain Republicans, are going to have to worry about. Xi Jinping doesn't have any equivalent of a midterm election, right, that he has to worry about. That's the question. It's not just who can take more economic pain, the U.S. or China, who can take more political pain, the U.S. or China. And I'd argue there's probably a draw, if you look at it from that perspective, which would seem to indicate there should be some room for some agreement between the U.S. and China, because China does need to change. And likewise, the U.S. needs to reduce these tariffs. So there seems to be a playing field where they can meet, but whether they do so, whether they trust one another, that we don't know yet.
Okay, let's try to explore it a little bit more. So what do you think China and the U.S. might need from each other if and when negotiations actually start up? At the moment, they're still playing a game of chicken, but you can't continue that indefinitely. So at the end of the day, they got to sit around the table and say, we want this, we're willing to give you that in return for that. So what is the tit for tat?
Well, so what is it that and we say the U.S., but other countries want this as well. It's obviously only the U.S. negotiating right now. The question for the United States is, are we going to continue what Trump 1.0 had and what Biden continued, this concept of a small yard and a high fence, that it is important for us to trade and invest with China, but there's certain areas that we need to protect. You could put AI in that category, biopharma in that category. Obviously, anything from a military perspective goes into that category. So we're going to have a small yard of what we don't trade and invest with China, and we're going to have a high fence around that small yard so that you don't have any leakage. Now, the yard's getting bigger. Now, the question is, how much bigger will the yard get? And the question will be, will you have this yard fence concept, or is the United States going to say, we need to decouple? Secretary Rubio basically said this during his confirmation hearings. China is the existential threat to the United States. If things continue as they've been doing for another decade, that we are going to be subservient in some fashions or another to China. Therefore, we need to decouple. Now, if the United States is going to say we need to decouple, that is a very different negotiation than a small yard, high fence. Okay, from the China perspective, China recognizes that it can no longer be an export-driven economy. China also recognizes that there is a lot of diversion coming out of China from a manufacturing and an investment perspective. And that diversion is not just the United States and the Europeans and the Japanese and others diversifying out of China. It's the Chinese diversifying out of China. There's serious economic problems in China. There's political risk in China. Then there's the geopolitical risk in China. China recognizes that it has to address those problems, but will it do so with the United States at the negotiating table is a different issue. So unless we know what the United States wants to do, and good luck getting inside President Trump's brain, and unless we know what China wants to do at the negotiating table, good luck getting inside Xi Jinping's brain, it's very hard to figure out where we go next.
Right. So you mentioned the word existential enemy, right, which has been bandied around also under the Biden administration. Do you think that seriously will get in the way of reaching some kind of deal?
There has been a decoupling that has been going on for some time now. Go ask the U.S. social media companies what access they have to the Chinese domestic market. It's zero, right? They are banned from the Chinese market. China has said, we are going to decouple this way. The U.S. is saying, we want to decouple when it comes to AI and your ability to get the semiconductors needed for AI. So we see decoupling going from both directions. The question is China going to continue to decouple? Is the U.S. going to continue to decouple? Or are we going to come to some agreement that because the economies are so intertwined, we have to be able to find some middle ground? That's what we've had so far. It's what we had under the first Trump administration. It's what we had under the Biden administration. It's what we've had from Xi Jinping. Will that continue? And that's what we don't know. And that's why investment is really paused right now because of all this uncertainty.
Right. Of course, this kind of effort will require, in one way or other, sort of rolling back the narrative in America about China being the existential enemy, you know, the Red Scare, whatever you want to call it. Do you think that's feasible in the United States?
I think it's more of what is China going to do. I mean, when I started really working with and in China and spending a lot of time in China and having plenty of Chinese friends and working with Chinese businesses, the Americans had a favorable view of China. This isn't, I'm old, but I'm not that old, right? This isn't all that long ago that Americans had a favorable view of China. It now has a very much an unfavorable view. I mean, maybe like by 50 points, Americans have an unfavorable view of China. That is not because of what changed in the United States entirely, and I would say mostly. It is how China has changed over the last 20 years. So the question is, what is going to change in China? Is China going to change at all? That's going to impact how Americans view China more than anything that politicians do. Yeah, it's easy to blame China for U.S. economic woes, like we blame Mexicans, like President Trump is blaming Canadians.
Yeah, exactly.
So politically it's easy to do that, but this is a 20-year trend, or maybe a 15-year trend. This is not something that came in overnight.
Right, I'd like to turn now to the issue that you already mentioned in passing, but which I think is nevertheless very, very important. That is U.S. businesses and their position in this very complex playing field of decoupling, de-risking, but yet engaging. I myself have done quite a bit of research on businesses from Europe, Japan, Singapore, in China and how they react to these pressures. But I think for US businesses, it's a little different. Nevertheless, we do see a trend now with at least some companies that they're saying, well, we can't really do without China. We really need the market. We really need the manufacturing capacity. We really need also, increasingly, the innovation capacity of China for our global business. Do you think that is going to have some genuine, real political implications for the US government's policies, or where do you think this is going to go?
Well, when I first started going to China when I was with UPS in 2003, we had a soundbite that I used all the time. China is not an option, it is essential. It is essential for U.S. business to be in China. One, how big a market it is. That hasn't changed, of course, so it's a great market to be in. Great customers to be able to serve. It also, which is newer now, we certainly didn't say it 20 years ago, the innovation occurring in China. I don't know how many Americans still believe that China basically steals our intellectual property and then copies it. That was probably more true than not 20 years ago. That's not true anymore. China's innovating now. So it's really important for U.S. businesses, for any business to be in China, to be able to see the innovation that's going on. Because if you're on the outside and all of a sudden you get hit with the innovation from these Chinese companies, you're going to be in trouble from a competition perspective. So you now have to be in China, not just for the market, but for the competitors you're facing. So you do need to be making those arguments. There's a couple of things that have changed from 2003 when I would first, use that soundbite. And one of those things is that it has become much more politicized now. And certainly what's happened in Xinjiang, and you have, the U.S. coming out with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, where the Americans say there is a genocide occurring in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, and the presumption is anything coming out of that province is made with forced or slave labor. But then at the same time, the Chinese are saying there's no genocide going on. If there's anything, look, there were some terrorists there. We have the right to deal with terrorists, like you have the right to deal with terrorists, and you'd better buy those products because it's illegal for you not to. So if you're a U.S. company, you're stuck. That was not the case, 20 years ago. Wasn't even the case 10 years ago. So that becomes much more of a challenge, not just for U.S. companies, but Western companies. Anyone with a U.S. investor or European investor has to deal with that. That has changed a great deal. There's more political risk in China today. Certainly, if you were invested in the education sector, you had a very rude awakening in China because your investment basically, in some cases, went to zero. Right? Tech had a very rude awakening in China. We'll see if that comes back now. So there's political risk in China. There's geopolitical risk in China. There's economic risk in China. All of that said, you need to be in China, and it's become much more difficult to do that. But that is what U.S. companies continue to balance.
So what can U.S. companies, particularly the ones that you're most familiar with here in Southeast Asia, what is it that they can do to create a more favorable environment for them to continue engaging with the Chinese economy?
Well, one is what everybody is doing is diversifying out of China. This is not U.S. companies and Japanese companies. The bigger diversification coming out of China is Chinese companies.
Yes.
Right? Everybody learned out of COVID zero, you can't have all your eggs in one basket. You can't put your entire supply chain in one country. And so you must diversify out of China. So that has been happening well before Donald Trump's second term. It was happening a bit in Donald Trump's first term, but COVID zero really accelerated. So one of the things you have to do is diversify, and that's everybody. Chinese especially are leading the way in diversification, which is going to lead to more issues for Southeast Asia, which we could talk about in a moment. Right? But then the other thing you have to do is figure out, and it's very difficult, how do you be a global company in China? Because you must meet Chinese law, you must meet U.S. law or European law, whatever it is, and if they conflict, what do you do? Some companies I've heard have said, well, we're going to follow the Hong Kong model. We're going to do one company, two systems, basically. So, right, in China, we're a Chinese company, and then we're going to have a separate legal entity, and outside of China will be a non-Chinese company. Part of me facetiously will say, well, how did that work for Hong Kong? So having one country, two systems. There's a lot of challenges with that, too. So really, it is a high-risk environment that businesses and investors are trying to work through right now.
Right, about this one country, two systems things, or internal delinking of a company, or China for China policies. I've heard that also myself from European and Japanese companies and Singapore companies as well. Do you think that that is actually a feasible strategy? You seem to be a little bit doubtful about it, a bit skeptical about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's feasible to a point, but it's some question you can't pretend you are who you are not. And I mean, even, I've had this, when U.S. companies will, because, brand America is taking a massive hit right now under Donald Trump. And so they're trying to say, well, we're not an American American company, we're a global company. I'm like, well, good luck, okay? I mean, people are going to recognize where you are from. And yes, it can work to a degree, and let's see how well it's going to work for TikTok and ByteDance.
Right.
And so you see people trying this all of the time, but at the end of the day, if push comes to shove, Congress is going to say, TikTok, we don't care. ByteDance's international headquarters is in Singapore, and your CEO is Singaporean. You're a Chinese company controlled by the party. That is what the Congress found. So very difficult, depending on what your sector is, especially how you can try and say, well, we're not who we are.
Yeah, but the other way around, for foreign companies in China, sort of delinking themselves internally and setting up shop independently in China. I've heard this also from many people in foreign companies saying that this is an option, but they're not quite sure yet whether they're going to exercise it. But my question really is, if this is going to pass with many, particularly larger companies, doesn't that mean that America, Europe, Japan will actually cut in their own flesh and losing assets to the Chinese economy, because these companies that are then delinked in China will have very little incentive to continue to be linked with the global company, and they may just become Chinese companies?
The question becomes, what does it mean to be delinked? Where does the investment and the returns on investment go, and where do they flow? And there's huge benefits, of course, to being part of a global company with all of the R&D and access to markets. And so delinking, that's why it's so difficult to do. How much and how far do you go? And can you ever really delink? And that, that gets to the question that you really need to be concerned about in today's supply chain and global economy. Who is us? If you have a Singapore legal entity, it's got a Singapore business license, the United States could still say, no, that's a Chinese company. Or you could have a Chinese company come down to Malaysia and say, we're now a Malaysian company because you've got a board, majority is Malaysian. And you could even set it up so that the majority of equity is owned by Malaysians. But what if you have some licensing agreement that requires you to get all of your technology from this Chinese company? Sure. You're still controlled by a Chinese company. So is the Malaysian government going to say, oh, you're Chinese, or are they going to say you're Malaysian? This question of who is us is going to be extremely difficult and extremely important for governments to answer, for businesses to answer, for investors to answer. We saw a real-world example here in Singapore when the NVIDIA chips went into a Dell server, which comes to Singapore, which goes to Malaysia, which presumably goes on to China, and the United States says, that's not allowed. And the Singapore government says, well, but it was a Singapore company sold to a Malay company. Okay, what are we supposed to do? And the U.S. says, well, what you're supposed to do is make sure the Malay company doesn't sell to a Chinese company. And the Singapore government says, how are we supposed to do that? That's what we all have to figure out now.
Yes, so basically you're saying that deglobalization is something that might not be possible, really.
We know who's going to do very well in this area. If you are in trade compliance, your phone is ringing off the hook.
Yes. Or if you're in the weapons industry, for instance, you're doing very well as well.
Well, that's a whole other sector that's out there.
I want to sort of wrap this up by talking a little bit more about Southeast Asian businesses. As you already said, they're very heavily involved in China, trade with the US, so they're really at the middle of this geopolitical conflict. Do you think that either China or the US will be able to exert enough pressure on businesses from Southeast Asia, from here, and governments from Southeast Asia to pick a side, as it were?
Well, we'll talk about the economic element first, and then we'll talk about the geopolitical element. From an economic perspective, the Southeast Asian companies and investors, and I presume governments, are extremely concerned because what happened in the United States when China took all of its excess capacity and dumped it, and I use that in a trade term because these are very good products, but dumped their products into the United States, and that hollowed out the U.S. manufacturing base. Okay, now if China can't take its excess capacity, which it mostly has, and put it in the United States, where is it going to come? Well, if it comes to Southeast Asia, it is going to harm the Southeast Asian businesses. What's going to happen to Southeast Asian factories? What's going to happen to the service providers to those factories? And so there's a lot of concern about a hollowing out here, which is why you see tariffs already going on from Southeast Asia into China. That's only going to get worse. Same thing's going to happen as Chinese investment comes out of China and goes into Southeast Asia. Now, it's one thing to say we're going to take Chinese investment, put it into a Malaysian company, hire Malaysians, serve the Malaysian market, and keep the money in Malaysia. To oversimplify things, that hasn't been the typical playbook for Chinese. It's right. Go into Malaysia and the money comes back to China. Well, that harms Malaysia too. So you've got real concerns in Southeast Asia about the second order effect of the Trump tariffs, which is what is China going to do in response, meaning into this part of the world. So that is your economic concern. Now you have your geopolitical concern, which is if the United States says we are going to lower our reciprocal tariffs on you if you don't trade with China or you don't invest with China, force a decoupling that way. Well, we know China's not going to like that. Xi Jinping has already said to the governments in Southeast Asia, you would better not do that. So all of the requests, the pleas from the governments here, please don't make us choose. Well, what happens if you are forced to choose? We don't know yet, but that is something that is going to cause a lot of dislocation and concern.
Right. But basically, picking up on a point you were making, Donald Trump doesn't even have to force them to decouple from China, because the tariffs that he is imposing on China will already have effects in Southeast Asia that will make it less attractive to be fully coupled with China. So in a sense, if you play a slightly longer game as an American president, you just let nature take its course.
And then the question is, though, what will Southeast Asia do? I mean, look, like I said back at the beginning, the America First correct realization is if we negotiate one-on-one, we always win. We will get a better result. Negotiating one-on-one, we will win more. We will win bigger than if we are in a bilateral or plurilateral perspective. So what is it that any government should be do? Don't negotiate one-on-one. Team up.
Yeah.
Then you're going to be stronger. You look at what happened domestically in the United States, right? With the law firms. Donald Trump picked those law firms off one by one, and they all caved, and then they all gave in to whatever it is that they wanted. But you look at Harvard, which Harvard said, we're not going to do this one-on-one. We're going to bring in other universities with us, and we're going to have a stronger case. Will the governments here be more like Paul Weiss, the law firm, or will they be more like Harvard? And the question becomes, will ASEAN come together to negotiate collectively?
Yes.
Now, ASEAN has been geopolitically irrelevant. It was designed to be geopolitically irrelevant, and it's lived up to its design. It's geopolitically irrelevant. Will it become geopolitically relevant now and bring people together to negotiate? I mean, I'm doubtful, but let's see what happens, because you never know. Donald Trump can do things that no one else has ever done, intentionally or otherwise.
Yes, well, unintentionally in this case, yes.
Exactly.
I mean, I fully support your idea of teaming up. I mean, I've been saying the same thing about Europe more specifically. And I think there's a real case to be made for Europe and ASEAN actually to team up on this particular issue. And I think it's in the best interest of both trading blocs to do so. The question is just, as you say, will they have the political wherewithal to pull this off, or to want this even?
Well, it's not just the politics. You have the prisoner's dilemma as well, which is if you cut the deal first, you get the better deal.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then the other issue is a lot of the countries in ASEAN compete with one another. Right? They're competing for U.S. and European and Japanese manufacturers to go there. They're in competition with one another. So if they work individually and they get a better deal, they can take investment, making it up, from Malaysia, and then it shifts to Thailand. Or Malaysia investment goes to India, or Thai investment goes to Malaysia. So there's incentive to not work together if you look at this from a what is in my country's best interest. So you've got both prisoner's dilemma and I can beat out my neighbor. That's going to make it very difficult to have these countries come together.
Divide and rule, as it were.
Yes, yes.
All right, well, this has been a very interesting discussion, and thank you very much. And with this, I would like to thank you, Steve, for joining us. Once again, I'm Frank Pieke of the East Asian Institute in Singapore, and you have been listening to the East Asia Pulse. To learn more about our work and stay connected, you can subscribe to the EAI's mailing list on our website or follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.